While states have existed for thousands of years, and these states have experimented with various techniques of extracting resources from society, it was only in the 19th century that it became possible for states to exert sustained, directive control over society. The state development projects of what James Scott calls high modernism combined industrial technology with advanced techniques of government that made it possible for states to project power in new ways. By high modernism, Scott refers to the aggressive reordering of society in line with notions of scientific and technological progress. Modernism, in a political sense, can be described as a general tendency towards state centralization and a rationalized administrative bureaucracy. Its high or radical variant holds that this trend of centralization and rationalization is necessary so that the state may regulate society in such a way that it fosters human happiness and productivity. For the high modernist, progress means the conscious reshaping of a messy, complicated social reality into an articulated whole. This faith in progress was a 19th century faith, the animating ideal behind liberalism, capitalism, and imperialism, not to mention socialism. The fantastic technological and social transformations of life in industrializing societies encouraged a belief in limitless possibilities. The idol of progress crashed into ruin with the First World War, the trauma of which seemingly discredited all the optimistic certainties of the 19th century. But the catastrophe of the war itself set off a wave of revolutions defined by utopian social engineering, which inspired a new wave of development projects that adapted the faith in progress to a very different world. The tragedies of modernism that Scott studies resulted from the interaction of three factors. First was the high modernist faith that human happiness could be secured by ordering the world according to principles of scientific rationalism. Second was the accompanying willingness of states to use unrestrained force in pursuit of this vision. Third was the relative weakness of the social institutions that might have resisted the state's assault. For these reasons, high modernist state projects have been most common in colonized or revolutionized societies. In these societies, high modernist elites encounter the fewest barriers to the unlimited application of state power. In colonial zones, states operate with far fewer restraints on their behavior, while societies undergoing revolution experience social dislocations that allow aggressive states to assert new powers. But what kind of power are we talking about? It is true that the high modernist state deployed the classic elements of state power, armies, navies, etc., and it deployed them in especially ferocious ways. But modernist state builders also made use of novel forms of power unique to the modern era. The French philosopher Michel Foucault identified an early modern development in political power that saw the emphasis in politics shift from questions of sovereignty to questions of what Foucault called biopower. When Foucault discusses sovereignty, he wants us to imagine political power as expressed through the public execution. Public executions are traditional spectacles of power, in which political authority is demonstrated by the ruler's determination of who dies, and hence who lives. The symbol of sovereign power is the sword, the tool of violence that defines the use of political power in society. Sovereignty, then, describes a vision of politics defined by force and extraction in service of whichever ends the ruler commands. Biopower, by contrast, uses the coercive tools of political authority toward a wholly new end that Foucault describes as a general encouragement of life. That is, biopower aspires to examine society so that it may be optimized in order to produce more life, more abundance, more power. In this vision, the state functions like a kind of gardener. The state encourages and nurtures the development and expansion of life and activity, within the limits that it defines. That which impedes or threatens the health of the garden must be weeded out and excluded. Thus, the state's newly announced power over life becomes a power over death as well. Scott and Foucault, in concurrence with a wide range of thinkers, understand the state led genocides and ethnic cleansings of modernity as expressions of this attitude. Like the authoritarian high modernism that Scott describes, biopower has its left wing, right wing, and centrist versions. Here we'll concentrate on some of the assumptions and practices common to all forms of biopower. Biopower requires data. Like the scientific revolution that helped inspire it, biopower takes the rationalist attitude that in order to manipulate a thing, you must understand a thing. And in order to understand a thing, you must either literally or figuratively dissect that thing. In this sense, society was a kind of abstracted human body. Just as a doctor must understand the body in total intimacy in order to heal it, the state must know its society intimately in order to guide it. The science of statistics that may frustrate or fascinate you as a student is a product of this revolution in early modern thought. Modern absolutist states, in alliance with the mathematicians of various royal societies, devised the basic principles of statistics as a means of bureaucratically penetrating the social body. States took responsibility for counting everything under their rule: births, deaths, marriages, commerce, health, wealth. All the human and material substance that could be was numbered by the state. In this way, states could act with foresight and deliberation, pursuing a conscious course of social transformation that had not just the force, but the data to sustain it against resistance. Moreover, biopower has a growth instinct. All of its activities tend toward the propagation of life, as its practitioners understand it. Biopower shares with capitalism a fundamental commitment to growth for its own sake, which empowers mechanisms of acquisition and expansion that have no self-limiting principle. From this statistical foundation, states began to look inward and shape societies in ways favorable to the state's interests. By accurately counting populations, states could increase or decrease immigration according to need, or set tax policy with a realistic sense of what output a region was capable of. Think of our own census, a constitutionally required counting of the American population held every 10 years, which, among other things, determines the size of each state's congressional delegation and the amount of federal funding available to the states. States that effectively implemented these institutions of biopower developed subtle but crucial advantages over rival states and increased their own capacities. For example, the rise of universal basic education at state expense followed from a compelling need for a citizen body able to follow the law and perform increasingly complex labor. Our own present day battle over the question of universal health insurance in the United States is an echo of a social battle fought and won decades ago in the rest of the developed world, in which the state took responsibility for guaranteeing the health of its citizens as part of its general commitment to the politics of biopower. Indeed, the idea that the state is responsible for securing a basic standard of living for its population, compatible with that population's growth and contentment, is the central dynamic of biopower. This is what Michael Mann calls infrastructural power, measured by the ability of the state to control and direct key social institutions. If the old-fashioned sovereign demonstrates his political legitimacy by judging who can be killed and who can be spared, then biopower legitimizes itself by promoting the health and well-being of the population. The state's power is the power to encourage life and the conditions of its flourishing. Of course, what constitutes flourishing and its necessary conditions is a matter of interpretation. The ethnic slaughters and population removals that marked the United States in the 19th century, Europe in the 20th century, and large parts of Asia and Africa in the Cold War and its aftermath were all justified in terms of the health and security of a chosen population that was threatened. In ideological terms, victimized groups were supposed to present an existential danger to the victimizing group, which justified its killing and expropriation as self-defense. Just as biopower is applied by a state to guide and encourage the flourishing of a given population, it can also be applied to exclude, expel, or exterminate so-called dangerous or enemy populations. But we should focus on the key point that biopower mostly manifests itself in far more mundane ways than genocide. We already mentioned the question of national health insurance policies and welfare states, which since World War II have been the primary arena of political conflict in many parts of the developed world. Consider the politics of abortion and the so called culture wars here in the United States. Supporters of abortion rights tend to buttress their arguments by appealing to the individual's right to autonomy over her own body, which makes abortion a medical decision made only by patient and doctor. Opponents of abortion rights tend to group their arguments in a religious appeal, which requires certain beliefs about human beings and their place in the universe to have force. Much of this religious fervor is genuine, but it is worth noting that while in 2020 most opponents of abortion identify as evangelical Protestants, the first organized opposition to abortion rights in the 1970s drew its moral energy from Catholicism. Until abortion rights were secured by the Supreme Court's Roe v. Wade decision in 1973, most American Protestants were either generally in favor of or indifferent to abortion rights. It was only when opposition to abortion became a partisan issue that rallied opponents of feminism and women's rights generally, together with religious conservatives within the Republican Party, that an originally Catholic moral objection to abortion became a generalized and weaponized creed common to abortion opponents of all faiths. But what if, instead of taking at face value the claim that opposition to abortion is grounded in just religious objections, we consider the rival claim that abortion politics is fundamentally about who gets to control human reproduction? Here is where biopower comes in. Until very, very recently, virtually all modern states actively encouraged population growth. More people meant more citizens, more soldiers, more workers, more farmers. Like financial capital, the growth of population was always welcome and avidly pursued. But there are many cross-cutting pressures within modernity, trends and developments that evolve according to their own logic and interact with one another in unpredictable ways. Social scientists have conclusively documented an inverse relationship between women's education and motherhood. The more educated the woman, the fewer children she will have in her life. In conjunction with drastic drops in child mortality and changing labor patterns, the more modern a society becomes, the fewer children its mothers will bear. Hence, the question of who controls reproduction, the individual or the state, emerges into politics. In the United States, abortion rights are the centerpiece, but it should be noted that an underlying priority of the anti-abortion movement is to restrict birth control as well. The question of control becomes central from this point of view. How far can the state go in disciplining the bodies of women? What rights take priority when it comes to the fundamental social fact of human reproduction? We can easily see abortion politics as a form of biopolitics, and we can use this same prism to interpret any number of the political phenomena around us. To close, we should avoid any temptation to think of biopower itself in moral terms, as either a good or a bad way to organize societies. Not that one shouldn't have a moral reaction to this concept, but I want to emphasize the importance of thinking of biopower as a set of tools. These tools can be put to use in a number of ways and produce a wide range of outcomes. What matters is the intent of the tool users, a question that brings us back to the ideologies and interests of the state authorities that applied the techniques of biopower to reshape society.